All right, everybody. Thank you all for coming today to learn a little bit about AMPscript. This class is titled AMPscript 101. Basically, we're just going to break down the basic use cases and syntax and functionality of AMPscript for you. My name is Brent Wagner. I work for Salesforce.org at the moment. I started with ExactTarget in 2011 and have been working with Marketing Cloud ever since in professional services or internal marketing for either ExactTarget, Marketing Cloud, or Salesforce Core. And now with Salesforce.org. So what is AMPscript? AMPscript is a proprietary scripting language that was developed by ExactTarget back in 2008. The name is a little funny. It's called AMPscript. AMP doesn't stand for anything. It's not an acronym. It's just marketing, as was a big thing back then. So don't go looking for more meaning than there is in it. It has basic syntax similar to Basic, so if you're lucky enough to be as old as I am and you learn Visual Basic or even Basic, or the initial version when you were learning programming or were introduced for programming, this syntax will look very familiar. It has a C# back end behind it, but you don't need to know any C# to interact with it. So. What it does primarily is allows you to do three things. It allows you to interact with existing data you have in your Marketing Cloud instance, and I bucket that into two things. You can either pull in subscriber data directly into messaging, so this AMPscript works in all messaging aspects of Marketing Cloud, whether that be push or SMS or email, as it's most commonly used. And the other things you can do is actually just manipulate strings, dates, and format data. So format it for a more user-friendly output, again, and then putting into an actual email the subscriber data. And then the last one is basically what I call pseudo-segmentation, which is essentially you can drive what content people see based on aspects of their profile or their data. So you're not actually showing them specific data, but you're driving what they're seeing, which you could obviously do with segmentation as well. But AMPscript allows you to kind of multitask within an email. I don't intend to make any forward-looking statements during this presentation, but if I do, make any decisions you have on purchasing based on existing functionality, not anything I say. So AMPscript is not the only answer if you want personalization in your emails. If you've used Marketing Cloud at all, you should be aware there's a variety of ways you can dynamically create content and manipulate content within Marketing Cloud. It is one of the kind of upper levels of personalization, so if you need something that's a little more complicated than just swapping in and out content based on subscriber data, then you might be looking into AMPscript. If you want to communicate into Sales Cloud or Service Cloud, something like that, AMPscript's probably more up what you need. But we do have dynamic content, which is essentially just the UI interface where you can select which content blocks you want to display based on subscriber attributes or data extension attributes. We have personalization strings, which I'll talk about at the end, are not AMPscript, but they do function in a similar way where you can actually just inject in subscriber data directly into a messaging platform. And then we have AMPscript, which is kind of middle upper range. And then we have Einstein, which is kind of our most advanced version of allowing you to populate content into messaging. Obviously, there's a lot more that comes with Einstein, but there's also the predictive aspect of Einstein that's pretty handy. So AMPscript Basics. So AMPscript is, for better or worse, a very, very flexible programming language / platform / scripting environment. You don't have to specifically declare data types. You can interchange things. You can check for equivalence between Booleans, numbers, and strings. If anyone's super new to programming, so a string is any text, a number is obviously a number, and a Boolean value is a true or false. So you can check whether or not a string of true is equal to a Boolean value of true, which is equal to a number 1. All of those will be equivalent. So it's very flexible, which can be good or bad depending on what your background is. It's nice and forgiving, but it also causes some problems when you're trying to do things very specifically, expecting data types to react differently, and they don't. Everything is case insensitive. That's 99% true. There's very few situations where that's not true, but generally speaking, variable names don't matter if they're uppercase or lowercase. Even if you declare it one way, you can reference it another way. Obviously not ideal programming practices, but it's fine for the use case you have. Again, Boolean values can be capitalized or not capitalized. They can be mixed case as well. So again, it's nice and forgiving. I personally like to keep all keywords in AMPscript in capitalized letters for the most part. Like you can see the capitalized if, just to begin something. That's just a personal preference though. You should probably, if you're starting up new implementation of Marketing Cloud in your environment, you should probably pick kind of a style guide, if you will, and keep consistent. But it's pretty open, and you can do whatever you want with it. So if you're more familiar with another language and you're used to coding in a certain syntax in a certain method, you're welcome to stick with that and continue doing that. Comments. Comments are great in scripting because it allows people to know what you were thinking and what you were doing when you did stuff. Comments in AMPscript are delimited by that /*/, so it's a block delimiter. You can comment multiple lines. You can comment a single line. Whatever you need to do. There are no inline comments. That's the one comment option you get. Strings can be delimited with double quotes or single quotes, and these are all just straight quotes, so don't cut and paste from Word. Always use that's actually an inch marker and a foot marker. Realistically speaking, it's not quotes at all, but most people commonly think of them as quotes. And the benefit of this is that you can use whichever one you're more comfortable. Again, if you're coming from another language, it's great because you can adapt to whatever that was. It also allows you, if you're, for example, putting in HTML blocks within your comment, often HTML blocks will contain double quotes and not a lot of single quotes. So you can delimit with single quotes in that specific situation and use double quotes the rest of the time if that's what you're more comfortable with. Or you can actually escape the quote character by just repeating it. So you'll see that first case where it says Brandt's brand. It's got two. That's actually not a double quote. That's two single quotes. So we're starting the string and then escaping the second quote so we can include that apostrophe within the string itself. Essentially, AMPscript is a procedural language. It processes from the top down. There's some nuance to that on the back end, so things like all the AMPscript calls are actually made at the end, but if you reference something below that you haven't defined above, it's not going to work, which is common across almost all programming languages. So just work your way from the top down. Can anybody read this? Oh, it's actually pretty big up there, so you might be able to read it. This is actually what we're going to talk about this class. I just wanted to put it all on a slide. If you can understand what this says, you're probably in the wrong spot. You should probably go to a different session. But if you can't understand what this says or can't read it, I'll explain it to you, and it'll be a lot bigger on the next slide. But I just wanted to give you a specific use case to be able to dissect and show you what we're going to actually build. So this is my lovely web page that I built for us to demo. Obviously, I didn't spend much time on the style sheets, but essentially, you can put in an email address, click submit, and it'll pull back a list of classes that person has signed up for. You can go back and actually input a different value. So I think we changed these. Let's see. Okay. I think that's right. Oh, see, then put a little error capturing in there as well. But basically what this is doing, as we'll talk through, is it's taking a value you're providing, it's converting that value to an ID, and this is just to walk through the different things we can do, and then with that ID, it's looking up into a table called a data extension within Marketing Cloud and pulling back any records that are related to that ID. Let me go back to the other screen. So we'll start at the top. Actually, before I do that, you'll see at the very, very top there's a %%, it's a square bracket. So there's two sets of delimiters in AMPscript. There's the block delimiter, which is that square bracket, and then there's also an inline delimiter where you're outputting HTML and you're actually going to inject it directly into your HTML content, which you can see right here on that form action. So that's an inline delimiter where it's %, equals, and then a function name. So those are the two different delimiters that you're actually going to wrap around AMPscript content when you're putting out content. Primarily, you're going to do a lot of the block delimiters to do most of your processing and most of your pre-processing and get things all set up, and then you're going to use the inline delimiter just to output content. You can mix the two and interact between the two. And you can actually open and close things as well. So you'll see there's a line in there after the next and else where there's an output. So we could actually close the block delimiter, put the output line as an inline delimiter, and then open block again. You can keep opening and closing things, and as long as it's continuous and consecutive, it's fine. So you can mix up what you're doing there. But generally speaking, you have either block delimiter or an inline delimiter. I took them out of here just so we could see things bigger. So what we have here is the first line. We've got a var keyword. So var is defining a variable. So you're allocating some memory for the system for a variable. So The way variables are distinguished in AMPscript is with the @ symbol. So @ plus any string following that is going to be a variable name. You can't start with a number. I don't really know why they just made that choice, but you can. So any string text, you can include numbers after the string starts, but whatever. So you are declaring basically there, so you're saying these are the variables I'm going to use throughout this script. Another caveat, if you're familiar with other languages, you do not have to declare your variables. It is best practice to declare variables, but AMPscript will not catch you if you type something wrong when you have a variable name, or if you want to ensure that all of your variables are used and utilized. It's not going to stop you. It's just going to assume that you created a variable on the fly and let you use that variable, even if it is a typo. So you get the benefit of flexibility that you don't have to put everything up there, but you also get the disadvantage of it. It's not going to stop you from using something you didn't declare. Next line is we're setting a value to a variable. So you see the syntax is just set, and then you set the variable, and then you use the equal sign. And in this case, we're using a personalization string or a system value, which is this underscore email ID. So that's basically just passing an email ID that is available from the system. So there's a whole list of personalization strings that the system stores. One of the main ones is underscore subscriber key, which is just what it sounds like. It's the subscriber key in your account, which is a really critical piece of information. So you don't want to have to keep searching for that all the time. So it's available as a system value. So for every subscriber, you can always reference it the same way. Next line we've got is a conditional. So we're just saying if something is not empty, in this case, we're requesting the parameter of the email address we passed in. So as you saw in the form, you're typing in an email address. If you don't type anything in, this is going to throw an error and say you didn't type anything in. So again, this is stuff that's on the landing page, and more just so I can explain functionality to you. You probably wouldn't build a landing page this way, and you can actually do this directly in an email, and it's a little simpler because you don't have to do this error catching. And I'll show you the script to do that, and it's actually a lot simpler. But this is allowing me to give you examples of what you can do with it. So you can use a function called empty, which tells you whether or not something is empty or null or unset or undefined. And if it's not empty, then you're going to go ahead and take an action, because if it is empty, you don't want to do anything because it's empty. So if it's not empty, we're going to set that email address into a variable that's passed in. We're going to wrap it with a function called trim. Trim is just a simple function that trims off white space, because oftentimes when people are typing in forms, they hit the space bar at the end, because that's what they do when they're typing, and they hit enter. Then you've got an email address with a space on the end that you don't want. So we have a trim function that can just chop that off for you without even thinking about it. The next line, this is where, as I mentioned, we're getting a student ID from the email address, because when you're a student, you never know your student ID. You know your email address, so we're going to look it up for them so they don't have to remember their student ID. And this is using what's called a lookup, or this is a basic syntax for a lookup. What this type of lookup does is it returns a single value, just one value from a data extension based on the parameters you pass in. So we're looking in the student's data extension, which a data extension in the Marketing Cloud is essentially just a table from a spreadsheet or a database, whatever you want to consider it. We call them data extensions because they're fancy, again, like AMPscript. We just like marketing terms. So we're looking in students, and then we're going to return ID. The ID is the column name of the field we want, so it's the ID field in the data extension that we have. And then we're going to match based on the field email address or the column email address where the email address equals the value we just got passed in. So we set that email address that we passed into a variable called email. So we're checking to find the ID of the record within students that matches that email address. If there isn't one, we won't get anything back. If there is one, we'll get one value returned, and that will be the ID of that student. So once we've got their ID, we decide, did we get a value? If we didn't get a value, then we want to throw another error because it's no good. We don't have any records for that person. So we want to tell whoever's looking at this page what happened, and that is that we didn't get any values back. If we did get a value, what we're going to do is we're going to do another lookup, but this is a more advanced type of lookup. This lookup doesn't return just a single value. It returns what's called a record set or a row set. What that is basically an entire row or multiple rows of a spreadsheet or a table. So when you look up, in this case, we're actually using a modifier of lookup as well, which is called ordered rows, and that, just like it sounds like, allows you to sort your return. So typically, there's a lookup rows, which will just give you everything. It's not sorted. If you want it sorted in a particular order, in this case, we're sorting based on time, because as you saw, we're looking at schedules, so we're looking at what time classes start and that sort of thing. So we wanted them sorted in the order so we could display them so you could see chronologically when your classes are, essentially. The syntax is very much the same though. So we're looking at classes is the data extension we're looking into. 0 is a value we're saying we want it to return how many rows. In this case, 0 means as many as you've got. The platform will cut you off at 2,000. If you need more than 2,000 for some reason, you're probably doing something wrong, but there are certain situations where you might want that. You can actually define in this particular function how many you want. You could say 25,000 rows, and it will return them if you tell it that you want that many. It doesn't have to be exactly 25,000. If it's 18,000, it'll still give you all of them. But you have to set that high point of where you're going to. If you put 0, it'll give you back whatever you got up to 2,000. And then again, we're matching on student IDs, where student ID column equals the variable we set as student ID. So what's important about this is we don't know how many rows we're going to get back, because this is classes this person signed up for. So they could be signed up for 1 class, they could be signed up for 10 classes. We don't really know. So we need to check and say, hi, how many rows did you give me in the return of that function? And that's what we're doing here is we're setting a variable not to this function, but we're actually setting the variable to whatever that function returns. So we're getting that record set and sticking it into that variable at rs, which is just shorthand for a row set. Then the next line, we're going to row count. We're going to count the row set. So that's going to return a value of 0 to 2,000. So a little more on data extensions and lookups. I think this is probably the most powerful part of AMPscript, and it's probably the most commonly used part and most useful part for the most part of AMPscript is it allows you to access the relational data within your system. So it doesn't have to be in the subscriber data extension or the sendable data extension you're utilizing, or if you're using Journey Builder, it doesn't have to be in the entry source, any of that stuff. You can actually just look up any data within your system and get back the data you need, as long as you have a unique identifier that you can pull it back with. And all these functions have one-to-many conditions that you're matching on. So in this case, you see I'm only listing customer ID equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but there's that little bracket dot, 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 which means you could also do name, you could also do last name, you could do whatever values you want, and you can expand that as far as you want to go to get as granular as you can. Again, lookup will only return one value. The challenge with this can be that that one value may not be the value you want. So if there are multiple values within that data extension for the particular criteria you described there with your customer ID in this case. So if there's 4 or 5 records for that, we're going to get one value back. You don't know which row that's going to be. It could be any of them, really. But it basically is usually chronological based on when that record was created, and you'll usually get the oldest record, but it's not necessarily always the case, because it's based on the database sorting of how that table is indexed. So just be a little careful. If you're only pulling back one value, you should be pretty sure that that's a reference table where there's only one instance of each subscriber in there, or each ID that you're looking up on. Lookup rows, on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, has multiple versions. It has ordered rows, which is the one we looked at a moment ago, and also CS, which basically means case sensitive. So that's just if you have a reason you want to match on a case sensitive name, like somebody's first name for whatever reason, you don't want lowercase versions, you only want capitalized versions, you can use that function and it'll do that, because otherwise it'll be case insensitive when you're looking up text. So that lookup rows, syntax is much the same, except you don't tell it what you want back, because it's going to give you every single row or every single column in that data extension that you've asked for. So that could be 200 columns, that could be 4 columns. It doesn't make any difference. Obviously, that's going to have a little bit of an impact on your send speed and how much that impacts how you're doing things. So if you're sending 100 million records and you're doing 3 or 4 lookups, and there's 300 or 400 data or columns in each table, probably not going to be very performant. So just be a little cautious on that. Best practice is usually under 5 lookups, ideally under 3 if they're large. They're pretty fast, relatively speaking, but if you're hitting higher volumes of folks in your sends, just be a little careful, and if your sends are going slow and they're taking longer than you expect, just double check that you're not doing a lot of lookups, because what happens when you do a lookup is it's actually reaching out to the database to get stuff, as opposed to just sitting on the engine that processes the email sends. Just a visual example here of what you're getting back. Again, single row or multiple rows, or single value and multiple rows. All right, so we've got our row set back, and now we have more than one row, hopefully. Sorry about my FaceTime there. So what we're doing is, if we have more than one record, which we're doing with a check to see if row count is greater than 0, Because if the row count's 0, we don't have anything to do. So we want to, again, throw an error or deal with the situation somehow. We're going to figure out what to do with it. But if we have more than one, then we can go ahead and move forward and start processing that data. So we're going to, in this case, we're going to output some HTML just to create a table for our output to look pretty. Again, this is a case where you could open and close stuff and put that directly in HTML. Like if you had a really fancy table where it had lots of style sheets and stuff like that, you might not want to use the output functions because it's going to start looking messy. So you could actually just eject that and put it directly in line. Then we're going to do what's called a for loop. A for loop is just a simple structure that allows you to cycle through things. You give it a starting point. In this case, we're giving it a starting point of 1 because 1 is how AMPscript starts counting. It doesn't start at 0, it starts at 1. So the first record is the first record. And then you give it an endpoint. And I like to give it a variable, which in this case is the row count. Because giving it a variable as opposed to just putting the function, which you can put in there, you can put just row count and the row set directly in there. But if you do that and you want to jump out of out of the loop, you can't do that because it's going to run until the end. Whereas if you put a function, you can kind of get away from that and exit the loop whenever you want by defining the criteria and then jumping yourself out by setting the row count total equal to the current value, and then it'll kick you out of the loop. It's more of an advanced thing, but just as my best practice, I say use a variable there, even if you know it's always going to be row count and you feel like you're wasting a line of code. It gives you an escape route that you wouldn't have otherwise. So after we set those parameters, we do for a value of I, and then it doesn't have to be I, it can be any variable. You can have it as long or short as you want. I is pretty common in programming because it stands for index or indices or whatever you want to say, just kind of best practice or normal practice. And then we'd say to a certain point, and there's also another variable you can use of down to, which means you can go down in numbers instead of up in numbers. There's some situations where you want to do that. I've rarely used it in practice, but it's nice to have in a couple cases where you do. And then we're going to give it the keyword do, which basically means start the loop here until we hit the next keyword, which is going to be on the next slide. Oh, no, it's actually right there in the middle of the page. So we're going to do everything in there over and over and over until we hit the end point. So everything between the do and the next, we're going to repeat for each record that we have in there. So as you can see, it's basically outputting a row of table data, which is a great translation. We're looking up a row of table data, and we're going to output a row of table data. And once we're done with that, we're going to close that table. So then we're going to have our complete table of HTML based on whatever records were returned from the row set we looked up for that particular subscriber. The function below that, it's just, again, that's if there were no rows returned, it's going to send a different error back, basically saying there were no classes for this particular subscriber, or for this student. Then we're just closing out some of the conditionals there of if there's any rows and if there's, it goes on to the next page, if there's something for it. And this is the else condition, which basically means if there was nothing passed in, we're going to go ahead and put the form on the page. Oh, and this, so yeah, we're going to deal with errors first, so those output, and then we're going to output the form itself, which is obviously, as you saw, a really basic form. It's only got a couple elements in it. But what we do, and in this case, if our form action here is if you're using microsites or cloud pages, there's two functions you can use. In this case, we're using microsite URL. What that allows you to do is actually encrypt the submission of the form. So you don't have to worry about something like an email address being in plain text, being passed as a parameter. You can actually just, it gets encrypted when it gets submitted, and then you extract it back out. Just the same way with using that request parameter function. If you're using Cloud Pages, it's a slightly different function. It does the same thing, essentially, but it's called Cloud Pages URL. And then we're going to post this. So we're passing in a form value. And we close it all off, and then you can see the block delimiter there at the end. And gave a little example there of how this whole thing is wrapped with that conditional at the beginning. So here's the email version of the same script. So again, this does exactly the same thing, except for there's no error checking, and it's basically not requesting a value. It's using your subscriber value for an email address because you already have it. Why would you ask for it? So in this case, we're just setting the email to email adder, which is, again, a system variable. You could also use subscriber key here if that's something you're using in your account as opposed to the email address. It does the same lookup, grabs the ID, does the same lookup, ordered rows, and returns the values, and then it outputs it. And again, here, in about the middle here, you can see how I'm closing the block and then putting out a bunch of HTML and then opening the block again. So it's just a different way of doing syntax. It's whatever you're more comfortable with. The one caveat to that is Content Builder is a little finicky about HTML being proper. So if you're doing something like this where you're outputting a part of HTML, it won't like it if you mix things up. You can use what's a new script block that they've added. Basically, the script block will prevent it from doing anything to your code. But if you use an HTML block or a freeform block or something like that, it's going to start messing with your code, which is not good. So if you're doing AMPscript at all in Content Builder, I highly recommend you use an HTML block for everything, basically because the freeform block has some constraints on what it can pass in, or it wants to clean up your code for you. And if your code is intentionally messy in its opinion, it will mix it up. And right now it doesn't throw an error or anything saying it rewrote your code, so it can be really frustrating when you close it, nothing happens, and you open it back up and it's gone. So just be aware of that and use an HTML block or use the script block ideally if you're using a lot of AMPscript in Content Builder. All right, as I mentioned earlier, personalization strings are not AMPscript. They are very similar in syntax and in function. Personalization strings are, if you are a really old customer using the list model still, they include attribute values. Attribute values are subscriber values that are assigned at the system level. Most people aren't using those, so don't worry about that. They also include personalization strings are a way to reference the columns in the sendable data extension. Those are kind of what are sort of referenced as dynamic personalization strings because they just appear based on what sendable data extension you're using. But there are also a series of system personalization strings that can be useful to you, depending on which environment you're using for whether it's SMS or email. Again, the underscore subscriber key is really useful. The underscore email ID is useful. And there's a series of others. There's a link in the reference section of this deck that has kind of most of the personalization strings listed out. So again, the syntax is very similar. It's %, no equal sign value. The problem with personalization strings is you can just output the value. You can't manipulate, you can't change. It's just gonna output whatever you got. Great in some situations if it's like, the point total of how many rewards points someone has, then great, who cares? You just output it, it's fine. If it's somebody's first name, that might not be ideal. You might have mixed cases, you might have messy input, you might have a lot of white space, things like that. So what you can do is you can actually pull it into AMPscript and manipulate it that way. Once you use a personalization string inside AMPscript, as we sort of already saw, you drop the %. That's only if you're using it inline within your email itself. So a little block at the bottom here is showing you an example of the different things you can do with personalization strings with AMPscript. So there's a block delimiter. We're setting a value equal to a personalization string. In this case, it has a space, so we're putting those square brackets around it, because if you don't, it'll think that you're just looking for last, and it won't know what you're talking about, because last probably doesn't exist. Last name, however, does exist. So it's basically just a way of saying, this is one personalization string, ignore the spaces. Once you have that, you can output that with the V function. The V function is just like what it looks like on the keyboard. It's like paste. It's a value is basically, I think the real reason it's called V is it's outputting a value. So that % equals V will output what's in that variable last name, which in this case is what's in that last name personalization string. V, the second line where it says V, also shows last name, but that way we're not setting it to a variable first. We're just outputting the personalization string directly from the output function. And the last one, we're actually just dumping out the personalization string itself. In this case, since our data was pretty clean, they all result in the exact same thing, which is my last name. In some cases, that's good. Some cases, it's not, so you'll have to do some cleanup. You can run some extra functions. Again, that trim function we looked at earlier, you can do that to clean that up. You can check to see whether or not it's, if you want to manipulate your data, there's something called proper case that will mix or take all your capitalized full caps names and put them in title case where the first letter is capitalized and the rest is lowercase. That can be useful. Just a little careful with that because it's not going to catch things like Joanne or Leanne or whatever compound names that are intended to be mixed case. So just be a little aware of that. But if you've got really messy data where everything's capitalized, you might want to use that anyway because it's going to be cleaner for most people than not. Just a couple best practices to do to kind of summarize what we would like you to be doing. Again, this is the top one I already mentioned. Use HTML blocks. Ideally, use script blocks. I know that can be a little cumbersome just because it doesn't do any formatting or it doesn't show you anything pretty. But it is a really nice functionality that didn't used to be there and it now is there and is very beneficial because you can actually just drop them in instead of having to actually use the drop-down menu thing to inject them into content. Limit your lookups, as I mentioned earlier. best practice is 5 or less. Generally, we like to see 3 or less, and that includes lookups. Even if you're only returning one value, the time consumption or the processing consumption is actually looking into the database. So it doesn't matter if you're returning 15 rows of 100 columns or if you're looking for one value, it still takes the same amount of time to reach out to the database because that's the part that's slow. It's not the returning of data. So if you need more than one value from something, you should probably almost always be using lookup rows. If you can't use less than 5 or less than 3, again, it's going to matter a lot on your volume, how big your data extensions are, that sort of thing. There's a lot of variables involved. But if your sends are going really slow, or you've been doing this and your sends are going really slow, try what we sometimes reference as pre-baking your data or pre-manipulating your data, where you take those multiple sources of data, merge them into a single source that you can access more easily with your lookups. So you can minimize that. And you can do that in Automation Studio and just crank it into a data extension right before send time and look it up that way, and it'll speed things up greatly. Always use fallbacks, always use an else condition or a conditional to decide whether or not you have data. That's just a best practice because you don't want to error at send time. You want to avoid that pretty much at all cost, because what happens oftentimes is it will kill the send midway through, and then you can't really distinguish who got what, which is not ideal. So you really want to avoid a mid-send kill or error out. So how we do that often is just to make sure that you have a fallback. So if you're looking for a value to come back and you don't get it, put in some default content. Like we do this all the time with first names. It's like you look up their first name, you expect everyone to have a first name, but somehow someone slipped through without a first name. Put in some value. Don't use dummy. I actually have seen a customer who used dummy as their dummy value, and people were getting emails that said, to dummy or dear dummy. So pick something else, whatever it is. Subscriber is a good one, or something ideally more aligned to your brand. Test with identical data to your live send. So if you're doing, oh, I skipped raise error. You'll see there's a raise error function. Raise error, it does exactly what it says. It will allow you to throw an error to cancel a send or to error out a subscriber. The problem is that you'll still pay for that subscriber being sent to. So it's a great function for preventing bad things from happening or a send being killed, but don't use it as segmentation. Like, don't say raise error for everyone who's male when you're sending a female email. Just segment the data beforehand. Test your data with identical data. So everyone's had this where someone's like, oh, I'm going to give you this data. It's going to appear just like this. You build everything just for that, and then they give you the live data file, and it's totally different. So always I say, if you can get the data file as soon as you can, do that. Otherwise, look at partition by and over in SQL. If you have any experience with SQL, that's a great way to allow you to define which fields you want unique values for, and it'll return kind of a subset of your large data set. So if you have like 1 million records, and you want it to customize on status level, gold, silver, and bronze, you can run this function, include status level in what it's partitioning by, and it will return a unique value for each of those, and it'll basically number them all, but you can just grab the first row of each, so you'll have a unique value for each of those subscribers across your data set. And it works even better if you have multiple values you want. So if it was status level and, I don't know, some other value. Male and female, you can make sure you have all that stuff accounted for and get a much smaller subset of data to work with. And when you're debugging, break it down into as small pieces as you can, output everything, even the stuff you think you know is set the way you think it is, and just make sure that it's doing what you want and how you want, because otherwise you're just going to be banging your head against a wall, because it's usually, or almost always, something really dumb. It's not something like you totally thought the logic through wrong. It's like you missed a character, or you forgot a quote, or it's just a typo or something along those lines. So just always just break it down into a really granular level. Some references for you. Now these decks will be provided, but otherwise these are good references. The AMPscript function reference is great. I use it pretty much every day. Personalization strings I mentioned earlier, that's all the system personalization strings that are available. They're useful. AMPscript 101 to 401, if you've never used AMPscript before, those are super basic. They're super old. They'll use the classic interface in the examples they're showing, but they will get you basically everything I covered today as well, and it's enough to get you up and running with most of the use cases you'll probably have with AMPscript. And then Introduction to AMPscript session is a session. I did an Introduction to AMPscript that was an hour long, so it's a little more content than this, and it has some materials that come with it as well, so you can check it out. It's in the Success community. Thanks you all for coming, and if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Just step up to the mic in the middle of the room and speak away. If you don't have any questions, thank you all for coming and enjoy the rest of your time at Trailhead DX.